These sad, evocative ruins are all that is left of the great Britannia Music Hall in Glasgow.
They feel like the relics of a vanished civilization, mysterious and incomprehensible to us now. The Britannia was built in 1857 at the height of the British music hall boom, and this stage has hosted performances by some of music hall's greatest names. Dan Leno, the King's Jester, described as the funniest man on earth. Marie Lloyd, the Queen of the Halls, notorious for her innuendo, but adored for songs that found laughter in the adversities of working-class life. And a 16-year-old Stan Laurel, who made an audience laugh for the first time in this room.
In Victorian Britain, the music hall was ubiquitous. Every town, every suburb had its version of this space.
The period of their heyday was a time of colossal upheaval in British society, and the halls were an authentic, creative response to this rapidly changing world. A hilarious, absurdist, mocking commentary on the life and times of the people in song and laughter. Mass entertainment has been my family business for generations, and I want to trace its evolution back to its earliest roots. I'll be visiting the venues, the warm, bright, welcoming spaces that grew out of our pub culture. Pot houses that became grand palaces where even the king came for a good night out. I'll be rediscovering the performers and their songs.
Champagne Charlie is my name.
And trying to decipher some Victorian innuendo.
Daddy wouldn't buy me a Bow Wow.
And I just think they must have been absolutely wonderful, and I just really wish I could have met some of them. They sound absolutely great.
I'll be singing the odd verse myself. And finding out just who frequented the halls.
A jaunty angle or about there?
Look at that.
That's it.
Absolutely
Brilliant.
fantastic.
So let's have a look at the story of this wonderful institution, its stars, its audiences, the politics behind it, and just why it tells us so much about the entertainment we enjoy today.
Somewhere in this street, about 100 years ago, my grandparents, Olga and Isaac, began a new life in 2 rented rooms above a shoe shop.
They were Jewish refugees from the Ukraine and settled here in the East End of London, at that time indisputably the greatest city on earth. Isaac died young, and it fell to my Uncle Lou to support the whole family. He developed an act dancing the Charleston on a tabletop, and his career in entertainment began.
There must have been hundreds of stories just like his. A little talent carefully nurtured could offer a route out of poverty. When my Uncle Lou was dancing professionally in the 1930s, he was part of the variety business. The same business where later I learnt my trade as an agent. And it really was a business.
The slick, well-oiled variety industry had its earliest roots in the music halls, a largely working-class affair, where the main aims were to escape the harsh conditions of urban life by having a laugh and having a drink. This great enterprise we call the music hall was born in these London streets 100 years before my Uncle Lou first danced on his tabletop. Music hall grew out of many different forms of entertainment popular in the 1830s, like the pleasure gardens, where Britain's increasingly urban population enjoyed a taste of the countryside with refreshments and genteel diversions. The pleasure gardens behind the Eagle Tavern in the City Road hosted wrestling matches and circus acts, but also boasted a grand concert room. There is still an Eagle pub on the site today, celebrated in the nursery rhyme, "Pop Goes the Weasel." The Eagle was later described as the father and mother, the dry and the wet nurse of the music hall. Writer and broadcaster Matthew Sweet sets the scene.
So let's assume that you and I have decided we're going to the Eagle for the evening. I've never been before.
Yeah.
You're a regular. Tell me what I'm going to see tonight.
You won't believe all kinds of stuff, really.
Right.
Entertainers who purport to be from all over the world. They're probably just from down the road, but you never know. The giraffe girl with the extended neck. Kwang Seeley, the young Chinese positionist.
A positionist?
A positionist, a contortionist of some kind, who would bend his body into kind of remarkable, surprising shapes. Mr. Leach, the dwarf equestrian, who would jump around on the back of the horse and would impersonate figures of the period while sitting on the back of his horse. But
Comedians?
Well, singers, really.
Comic
songsters. Older forms of entertainment are dying away, or in some ways being kind of fleeced out of existence. Things like cockfighting.
The Eagle was certainly famous enough to come to the attention of Charles Dickens. And if I could read you a quick reference from Sketches by Boz. Never was anything half so splendid. There was an orchestra for the singers, and everybody was eating and drinking as comfortably as possible. Just before the concert commenced, Mr. Samuel Wilkins ordered 2 glasses of rum and water and 2 slices of lemon, together with a pint of sherry wine for the ladies and some sweet caraway seed biscuits.
Sounds really good, that, doesn't it?
So this wasn't a really rough crowd. This wasn't the dregs of society.
No. There's a lot of mahogany. You know, the quality of the panelling is emphasised. Dickens talks about the plate glass here, and that was a big attraction too. It had swinging plate glass doors, and they were something that people who came here remarked upon. So it was by no means a dive. It was somewhere very luxurious.
What were the audiences like? Who were they?
This area around here is relatively well-to-do. And if you look at Booth's poverty map of London, there are some quite wealthy people living around here.
So the catchment area was quite respectable.
Relatively, though one of the things that map reveals is how rich and poor live cheek by jowl all across this city. And so in that audience, you've also got the people from relatively poorer classes. The people who are working in this newly industrialised world all need something to do on their days off, on their statutory holidays. The Factory Act brought this in. There's time that you can't spend at work. So it means that...
You've got money in your pocket and you've got time off.
Yeah.
Enter
What are you
music
gonna do?
hall,
You're gonna go to the
pub.
Eagle.
There's nothing else to do. How wonderful.
The 1830s saw the rise of a 10-hour movement, campaigning for a shorter working day, and a series of factory acts ensured that manual labourers were guaranteed some leisure time for the first time in history. The pub became the centre of community life, but the working man wanted to do more than just drink when he got there. In the tap rooms and saloon bars, informal glee clubs began to give the punters an opportunity for a sing-song. These developed into song and supper rooms with professional singers and proceedings regulated by a chairman. One such was the Cider Cellars in Covent Garden, where one of the world's first one-hit wonders, a newspaper compositor from Glasgow called W.G. Ross, sang the grisly ballad of Sam Hall.
My name it is Sam Hall, Samuel Hall.
This is Peter Sellers recreating Ross's performance in 1970.
My name it is Sam Hall, and I answer one and all. You're a crowd of muckers all. Blast your eyes!
Sam Hall told the story of a murderous chimney sweep, contemplating his situation the night before he was taken to the gallows at Tyburn.
I killed a man, they say, and in Newgate jail I lay, and the final debt must pay. Blast your eyes!
Ross was a massive hit, and his success was due to something more than the ability to sing. He developed an act built around the character of Sam Hall, and it was artfully done. His soot-blackened features, his swaggering despair, the use he made of his simple props like the rough wooden chair, his cutty pipe, and above all his blood-curdling delivery, packed the house every night.
So it's up the rope I go, while you bastards down below say, Sam, we told you so! Blast your eyes!
Singers like Ross owed their success to their familiar routine, developing a recognisable persona with catchphrases that the audiences would happily hear again and again. Another early star was Sam Cowell, who was drawing crowds with an act based on the song Villikins and His Diner, a similarly morbid tale of a rich man whose daughter drinks a cup of cold poison when he tries to force her into an arranged marriage. Cowell was a fixture at a song and supper room called Evans's, which advertised itself as being for steady young men who admire a high class of music. These young men were establishing the idea of a social life, a very modern concept. The music they loved was also evolving a modern sound and structure, but its roots were still very traditional. I joined music hall enthusiasts Michael Kilgarriff and Barry Cryer for a bit of a sing-song.
The kind of song really was, I think, still very much redolent of the folk song kind of tradition. For instance, Sam Cowell in 1836, he was singing this one, still well remembered. "'Tis of a rich merchant I'm going for to tell, who had for a fortune an uncommon nice young girl. Her name it was Dinah, just 16 years old, with a very large fortune in silver and gold." Singing "Do-ra-lie, oo-ra-lie, oo-ra-lie." And again "Do-ra-lie, oo-ra-lie, oo-ra-lie."
Very good.
Very sad end, that song, isn't it? It's very...
But they loved it. See, songs about suicide were hysterical because everybody died young. You know, it wasn't a great tragedy.
But all the songs told a story.
They told a
strong
narrative. They told a through story.
They would choose a form of popular music that seemed very contemporary for them. So Viennese styles, for example, often influenced some of the earlier songs. One of Harry Clifton's most famous songs, Pretty Polly Perkins, is clearly a waltz. Oh, she was as beautiful as a butterfly and as proud as a queen, was pretty little Polly Perkins of Paddington Green. Wherever that song went, it would be adapted for another kind of audience. We tend to think of music hall always with a London focus, but for example in Newcastle, where they also were very fond of their music hall entertainment, Polly Perkins became Cushy Butterfield, a very different type of woman. Oh, she was a big lass and a bonny lass, and she likes her beer, and they call her Cushy Butterfield, and I wish she was here.
What became very clear to the publicans who ran these early tavern concert rooms was that offering any kind of entertainment would increase the sales of alcohol. The comic singers were interspersed with everything from classical recitals to grand opera. The Eagle even had its own opera company, staging the latest works by Rossini and Bellini. But there was one area that was forbidden to them. They were not allowed to stage a play. Since Charles II, London theatres needed a royal patent to allow them to present legitimate theatre, and the King only handed out 2.
In the 1830s, this was the extent of London's theatreland. The Royal Opera House here, or the Theatre Royal Covent Garden as it was known in those days, and just a few yards down the road, the Theatre Royal Drury Lane. Only in these 2 theatres could you put on a play. Now, the management of these 2 places obviously guarded their monopoly very vigorously. I think I'd have done the same if I'd been there.
London's smaller theatres had been loudly complaining about this injustice for years. Staging readings or incomplete plays, they risked a visit from the police every time they tried some new ruse to get around the legislation. Finally, in 1843, the Theatres Act abolished the patent system. Any theatre could now apply for a dramatic licence, but they would not be allowed to sell liquor, and performances would be closely regulated by the Lord Chamberlain. Without a licence, there were no regulations at all. Drinking and eating were permitted in the auditorium, and as long as they steered clear of anything that might constitute a play, no one much minded what was on the stage. The immediate effect of this act was to divide the sober and respectable audience for theatre from the more thirsty types who sought their entertainment in the pub tap rooms. As drink was integral to the success of these venues, it didn't take them long to choose. The term music hall was first used in 1848, when the Grapes Tavern in Southwark roofed over their coachyard and called it the Surrey Music Hall. The name struck a chord. The music may have had its rough edges, but what had previously been the domain of an elite was available at a price that a working-class audience could afford, and it was a runaway success. In the 1850s, a major building boom got underway. In 10 years, the number of music and dancing licenses issued by the London magistrates increased nearly 5 times, and by the middle of the decade, nearly 300 premises were in business. One of these new music halls has survived, hidden away in an alley in Stepney. John Wilton bought the pub The Prince of Denmark in 1850 and built a concert room in the garden behind. Wilton's was rediscovered and rescued from demolition by John Earl when he worked for the London County Council Planning Department in the 1960s.
This type of hall was always behind a pub. Originally, the first hall behind the building, it was a little concert room, was just the width of the pub. It went across the present room. And the publican Wilton bought the adjoining houses one by one until he could use all their back gardens to build the hall we're in now.
So you very kindly invited me to Wilton's Music Hall in its heyday, and we come in through the door. What do I see?
You'd come into this room, which was much, much bigger than the pub. It must have been wonderfully unexpected, the sheer size of it. And you'd find a room with a flat floor, like a concert hall, and at one end there would be a concert platform. There was a chairman sitting at a table with his back to the stage, and he has a dressing mirror in front of him so that he can see the acts on the stage while at the same time being able to address the audience. In front of him you've got ranks of tables, dining tables, and then around the hall, beyond the columns and forming a horseshoe right the way round, there would be a promenade in which people didn't sit at all. Booze was the essential element. That's what kept the place going. The earlier music halls didn't even charge for admission. By this time they were charging a few pence, but it was pence that you could present a token at the bar. That was wet money, and you got a drink to that value. That got you started.
So essentially, selling booze was a really profitable business if it could build this. How was it lit?
Magnificently.
Really?
It would be lit by gas, and in the centre would be a giant chandelier, the sun burner. It had a huge flue above it, a concentric flue, with one flue inside another. The outer flue got hot and sucked air up the middle one, so the air was continually changing.
Because everyone was smoking down here.
Everyone was smoking cigars and pipes. And the blaze of the music hall was a great attraction in itself. And the warmth, the place was heated. And for poor people in this area, walking into a warmed room was really something in itself, a beautifully comfortable place.
The entertainment would have started in the early evening and stretched to midnight and beyond. One continuous programme covering a wide variety of performers. Musical recitals would have been mixed with novelty acts, jugglers and conjurers, but the star turns were always the comic singers.
There is so much about comedy that's timeless. That what I was doing, even though I was talking about drugs and politics and surrealism and so on and so forth, that really, technically speaking, I was the same as any music hall comedian. I never actually thought about creating a persona for myself, but I think I just did it kind of naturally. When I started performing at the Comedy Store, in fact, I wore a leather jacket and chinos, and my hair wasn't that short, but very quickly I started going on stage, and it was during the kind of two-tone revival. I wore this kind of silk suit that I bought in an Oxfam shop, and something happened. I think partly because I'd started making money as a comic, I got fat very quickly, and the suit got really tight.
Let's go and get a light and better.
One of the things I was very keen on was that kind of cabaret thing, and that took place in venues where drink was served.
Ah, cheers, thanks a lot. Oh, nice one, yeah. All right, what are you having?
And similarly in the music hall, of course, the music halls were, in a way, the variety wasn't, that alcohol was central to the music hall, you know, and so...
Central to the economics of the
yeah.
The clubs that grew out of the alternative comedy movement in the 1980s are the closest thing we have today to the atmosphere of the original music halls. The acts on the stage competed with a very mobile audience, promenading, eating, drinking and having a good time amongst themselves. This is the Banana Comedy Club in Balham, South London, where I met a professor of stand-up comedy.
Try and imagine explaining Eric Morecambe to somebody who's never seen him. It's all in the looks, it's all in the connection with the audience. The further back you go, the harder it is to get what they were doing. And you get to early performers like W.G. Ross, and it's so tantalising. You have the accounts, you have photos, in some cases drawings, you have music, but we can't know what they were actually like. What we do know is that they must have been very gripping, magnetic performers.
The success of these performers seems to have relied on getting a balance between the singing and the patter.
Any form of popular entertainment which is defined by the effect you have on the audience, you know, anything you can do to involve them is good. So if they join in with the chorus, that's brilliant, they're on your side. If they go away singing your song, they're advertising your wares, you know, for future shows. In a way, music hall is the ancestor of both pop music and stand-up comedy. And there were some that veered more towards the songs, and the songs were important and people would hum them and sing along while they performed them. And for others, it was about the comedy.
But essentially, they started with comic songs, character songs, and they would develop a little bit of patter in between.
It's a little bit like what happened in the folk clubs in the 70s with people like Billy Connolly and Mike Harding and Jasper Carrott, in that they started as singers, and then gradually the talking, the funnies between the songs became more and more important. It's a particular kind of performance where what you're trying to do is grab hold of an audience, you're playing straight out to them. And if you don't do it properly, you know, you're going to come unstuck. Because actually in the music hall, if you read accounts of audience behaviour, they didn't just sit there politely.
Some audiences were less polite than others, though.
I belong to Glasgow, dear old Glasgow town.
The Glasgow Britannia was one of the city's most popular halls in its Victorian heyday, but it closed in 1938 and quietly began to fall apart.
But when I get a couple of drinks on a Saturday, Glasgow belongs to me.
In London, the acts may have been booed and hissed from time to time, but a Glasgow audience showed its appreciation in a more tangible form. Leading the efforts to bring this venerable old hall back to life is Judith Bowers.
I mean, they always talk about a Glasgow audience as being the toughest audience. And in fact, they actually say in Glasgow they left no turn unstoned, you know. And it's absolutely true, they were wild. They were really the people that lived and worked in this area. They're the poorest of the poor, working in the factories, the mills, the shipyards, and they were coming in here to blow off steam. 1/3 of the audience, boys aged between 9 and 13.
What were they doing there?
Well, they would come in here for their sport, really. And they sat in the front of the balcony against the proscenium arch there. And in that area, they've left graffiti carved into the woodwork at the front. And we found things like lots of marbles, bits of penny whistle, bits of tin whistle. And we think the reason why they liked the front of the balcony is because it overhung the apron in front of the stage. And from there, they could wee over the edge and hit the comic on the apron. And of course, the boys that couldn't get into the front of the balcony would position themselves around the back of the balcony, and from there they could throw horse manure. So you could shove it in your pockets before coming in and keep your hands warm, because it generates its own heat. The ladies allegedly used to bring in their own ammunition, which was also free and readily available, and that was the fish heads and fish guts from the fish market.
So to survive, the artists themselves, it was a battle for survival on this stage.
It was. You had to be good.
So in amongst the debris when you came here, you found all kinds of clues.
We identify where people sat in the building through what they've left behind. Well, we've got a few little buttons here.
But these are fly buttons?
But these are fly buttons, yeah.
So people were either having a pee or doing something
Or doing something
naughty.
And judging by the fact that these were all found along with a business card for Dr. Temple for diseases peculiar to men, I'll leave you to make your own mind up.
The connection between theatres and prostitution was an ancient one, and the music halls were particularly popular with a better class of predatory young men known as mashers, on the hunt for prostitutes. Rather half-hearted efforts were made to curb the trade, but it thrived nonetheless.
The mashers. Tell us who the mashers were.
Well, they were more your toffs, you know.
Oh, the toffs did come.
Yeah,
come
the
here.
toffs did come here to slum it.
Were the mashers coming for the entertainment or for the prostitutes? Do you
Both.
think both?
Bit of both, I think.
The prostitutes would ply their wares in and around inside.
Yeah.
Then where would they complete the transaction, as it were?
Well, probably where they were. I mean, there was plenty of distraction going on for the rest of the audience. And there were 1,500 people shoved in this small space, so, you know, you could probably get away with a lot up there, and nobody would notice. And don't forget the fact that smoking was notoriously bad in this building. The smoke was so thick that the audience complained they couldn't see the act on stage.
But when I get a couple of drinks on a Saturday, Glasgow belongs to me.
A visit to the Glasgow Britannia was probably as disreputable an experience as a music hall could provide. The Victorian reformers deplored the failure of the halls to achieve their great objective, to improve the lower orders. "We were told," moaned one newspaper, "that many people who now spend the hours of the night in dissolute indulgence at the public houses would in time be weaned from their evil doings." "Those who attended the halls," complained another, "were like the biblical sinners who would rather be drowned than get up and walk into the ark." But though it seemed an impossible goal, respectability was coming to the music hall. In Victorian times, this narrow lane just south of the River Thames was a marshy neighbourhood of slum housing crisscrossed by railway lines leading in to the new Waterloo station.
Right here, under these Eurostar rail tracks, is the site of probably the most important building in the whole of our story, the Canterbury Music Hall.
In 1849, the Canterbury was a modest pub with a skittle alley. It changed hands that year, and its new owner immediately set about an ambitious programme of improvements.
The word impresario was the Italian word to describe people who managed opera companies. But about this time, the meaning broadened to include anybody who invested in the music hall in show business. The word perfectly describes the man who built the Canterbury, Charles Morton.
It was Morton who grasped the potential of the halls like no one else. He had seen the runaway business being done in the East End, but he instinctively recognised the need to package this phenomenon for a wider audience. He wanted to cleanse music hall of its unsavoury reputation and make it safe for the middle classes. To begin with, he seemed to be following a well-worn path. This area was not obviously any more appealing than the East End slums. But Morton gained a London-wide reputation for the Canterbury by paying top rates to attract the very best vocal and comic talents to his hall in the unlikely setting of Lambeth Marsh. It worked. The location was close enough to the West End to draw in new audiences. And once you were inside the Canterbury, you knew you were in a different kind of establishment. Morton didn't stint on the decoration. It was a full-blown visual feast with all the lavish ornamentation we've come to associate with the Victorians. Rather more functional, but equally impressive, are the storerooms of the Victoria and Albert Museum in West London.
Kathy, what are you pulling out for us from these treasures?
This is our earliest box on the Canterbury Music Hall. Morton's great enterprise, which really kicked everything off because he did so well that everybody else wanted to imitate him.
Oh, the great man himself,
Look
yes.
at those whiskers.
Look, he's got a kind face, hasn't he? Respectfully yours. he began to see the value in a little bit of respectability.
Oh, yes, absolutely, because they weren't very respectable places. But the very innovative thing that Morton did was to have evenings for women, because he realised that women were excluded. And it certainly worked. And so from Ladies' Thursdays, there were then 2 ladies' evenings, until ladies could be there all the time, as is absolutely right and proper.
With greater respectability came greater profitability.
Yes, yes. And the other thing he did was to have an art gallery there. I mean, how respectable are we becoming now? Morton actually had his own collection of paintings by ancient and modern masters.
And were they ancient and modern masters?
Yeah,
were they anybody we've heard of?
No, they were. Look, Gainsborough.
Wow.
Hogarth.
Wow. Whoever bought this programme has annotated it with comments. Good idea, it says.
The culprit.
The culprit. This one says ugly, especially...
The women.
Especially the women.
Yes.
Morton's idea of picture galleries wasn't tokenism. They were a genuine attraction.
Absolutely. Of course, this is only 30 years after the National Gallery opened in London as well. So Morton is being very grandiose in having his own gallery.
And on the back, you will see the Royal Academy over the water, Canterbury Hall, Westminster Road. Suppers, etc., until 12 o'clock. Oh, we've got the menu here. Oh, that's wonderful. A 1 shilling supper. What have we got for dinner tonight, lads?
Cold roast beef, boiled fowl and bacon, haricot mutton, kidneys.
Boiled cod and egg sauce. Ugh. It must be a heck of a kitchen they were running there. What treasure are we going to find underneath here? What's this? Canterbury Hall, Verdi Opera, Macbeth every evening.
Yes, you see, improving.
Nice and bloodthirsty, though, isn't it? What's this? July the 1st. Can you read that?
59.
59, yes. Not the least remarkable sign of the spread of a taste for music in England is to be found in the rapid growth of music halls for the people. Sprung, oh, here we are. This is
Sprung from the concerts at supper taverns, the music halls have provided a purer class of entertainment, which are nightly resorted to by mechanics and their wives, and by the middle classes, who find provided for them the most excellent programmes, with artists fully competent to do justice to them.
Morton was making a fortune, and his next step was to move into the West End. The Oxford Music Hall, a larger and grander version of the Canterbury, opened here on the corner of Oxford Street and Tottenham Court Road in 1861. Morton's successful business model was quickly copied by others. This is Weston's in Holborn, operating on very similar lines. Morton's practice of paying premium rates for the top performers saw them start to earn sizable salaries, and we begin to see the birth of a modern star system. One of the first to benefit from this development was George Leyburn, better known today by the name of his most famous song, Champagne Charlie. Chris Beeching has written a biography of George and also performs a one-man Leyburn tribute act, which includes a more authentic version of the great man's nose.
When he was put under contract with the Canterbury, George could actually earn £120 a week. The people in the gallery he was playing to, they were earning £20 a year.
A year.
The mainstay of Leyburn's act was the satirical portrayal of the upper-class young man about town, frequently seen slumming it in the audience at the music hall.
As you may suppose, when you look at my clothes, I'm Prince of all nautical swells. And the fellows I meet...
They were known colloquially as dudes, mashers and toffs, or most commonly, swells.
The fellas look upon me with a jealous eye. The ladies all adore me as I saunter by. They titter and they blush, then after me they rush. For heaviest of heavy seaside swells am I.
I think he latched on to the upper-class chappies, these Piccadilly weepers, right?
Is that what they're called?
They're called Piccadilly weepers, and this is a Piccadilly window.
Wonderful.
Yes, it was marvellous stuff, isn't it? But these had become awfully popular, tremendously popular.
Decked out in a full set of Piccadilly weepers, it was Champagne Charlie that launched Laban into the big time.
Did he write Champagne Charlie?
Yes, he wrote the words. He was quite clever at playing a naughty double game on songs. There's the PRFG game. It's Private Rooms for Gentlemen, which were the rooms hired by the hour.
The thing I most excel in is the PRFG game. A noise all night, in bed all day, and swimming in champagne. For Champagne Charlie is my name. Champagne Charlie is my name. Good for any...
He had wonderful long legs as well. The women fainted at his legs, the length of his legs. Great charisma.
Champagne Charlie is my name. Good for any game at night. Boys will come and join me in the street.
According to the song lyric, Moet was Charlie's favourite brand of bubbly, and Laban was rumoured to be paid by the firm to push their wares and live a champagne lifestyle off stage as well. A rivalry developed with another comic singer known as the Great Vance, who promoted Clicquot in similar terms.
What we have here is the birth of celebrity endorsement.
Exactly. Yes.
And a brand war. We've got Clicquot versus Moet.
Yes.
Vance versus Laban.
Yes.
Now you're going to have the unenviable task of turning me into a top.
Yes, don't mind if I bend this. I'm sure you'll be able to iron it flat afterwards.
I have a man that sees to that.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, of course you do.
My agent.
Of course. Put the glass on.
Is that Victorian Velcro, or is it...
It's very Victorian. There we are, Michael.
There we go. Hope it fits. Nice material.
Yes, very nice.
I had a sofa like this. That's a three-piece suite, actually.
Oh, really? How lovely. A frock coat.
Frock coat. This is what the toffs wore, is it?
Yes.
I rather like this.
I think it looks splendid. And here is your crowning glory, the hat.
A jaunty angle, or about there? What do you think?
Look at this. The heaviest of swells. Fantastic.
That's
Look
it,
at
isn't it?
that.
That's it.
Absolutely fantastic.
Laban became a particular target of the highbrow press, who deplored the direction the music halls were taking. A man appears on the platform, dressed in outlandish clothes and ornamented with whiskers of ferocious length and hideous hue, and proceeds to sing verse after verse of pointless twaddle, wrote one reviewer. The female performers were even more maddening, he added.
Mother told me that I should do my utmost to be good.
Mother's advice was typical of the mildly suggestive material that played on Victorian fears of moral turpitude.
Mother said, whate'er you do, don't let boys climb trees with you. I'm glad I took my mother's advice. Mother's advice. Mother's advice. They don't climb trees with me. Oh no! They help me up and wait below.
But the most successful women performers developed a very sophisticated humour based on the day-to-day preoccupations of their audience. Drink, marriage, money worries, the seaside holiday, the lodger, and that great concern in Victorian Britain, their social status.
Bessie Bellwood, one of the most rumbustious of all the music hall stars, she had this song called Watcha Maria, and the idea was that she had a vegetable stall, and she'd had a particularly good week, so she decides to treat herself in the music hall, and instead of going up into the gallery with her chums, she splashes out on a seat in the stalls right by the chairman.
It has a very lengthy verse where she explains who she is, sets the narrative in motion. I am a girl what's doing very well in the vegetable line, and as I'd saved a bob or two, I thought I'd cut a shine. And then she explains that she goes and buys some toggery, these here weary clothes that you see, and with a shilling that she's got from selling her vegetables, she decides to go and sit in the stalls of the music hall.
And of course her chums will see her and they give her the razz, something like this. What's your Raya? Raya's on the job. What's your Raya? Did you speculate the bomb? Oh, Raya, she's a toff, and she looks immensely cough, and they all shouted, what's your Raya?
Her friends now decide they're going to play some tricks. So they throw an orange down, which lands in some beer. It shoots up, goes over her dress. She ends up rushing out.
A man with a false leg stuck his leg out and she tripped over the false leg, so smack on her face. So total ignominy.
So she explains in some spoken patter to this song that they went and fetched the chucker out. And he said, come on, Rhea, you've been kicking up a pretty fuss. Come on outside. I said, Sean. It's almost like a Barbara Windsor moment.
The moral of the song really is, well, know your place, you know.
She had no place being downstairs.
No, even if you've got the money, you don't belong there.
Bessie Bellwood began her career as a rabbit skinner working in the Cut near Waterloo Station. This seems to have been an ideal preparation for life on the music hall stage. She reacted aggressively to insults, real or imagined. On one occasion, she was arrested in the Tottenham Court Road for knocking flat a cabman who she felt had slighted her gentleman friend. Her most notorious talent, though, was for dealing with hecklers. Jerome K. Jerome describes seeing her in action.
At the end, she gathered herself together for one supreme effort and hurled at him an insult so bitter with scorn that strong men drew and held their breath while it passed over them, and women hid their faces and shivered. Then she folded her arms and stood silent, and the house, from floor to ceiling, rose and cheered her until there was no more breath left in its lungs.
She must have been a hell of a performer.
Sounds brilliant.
A woman after your own heart.
Oh, big time, yeah, absolutely. When you're in a comedy club and they're all drunk and they're all shouting abuse at you, as a woman, what comes back to you is previous occurrences where that's happened to you and you were helpless and you couldn't do anything. So that anger sort of wells up again a bit and you sort of think, how dare they? But here I am now, I've got the chance to answer them back.
I'm sure you think you've had it tough with some audiences today, but you've had the advantage of technology.
In the days of the musical, no microphone, and the whole place was one light, you know, you could
see them all.
Is that good to be able to see the heckler? Or?
Well, it's good to the extent that if you can see them, you can pick on some physical attribute they've got.
Or lack of attribute.
Or lack of attribute, that's right. On the other hand, as a performer, it's not great generally. I prefer to not see the audience because when you can see them, they somehow become more sort of human to you and you actually want to be able to be nasty to them if they're nasty to you. So I find that quite hard if you can see them. And every comedian that I know lives in fear of being destroyed by a heckler or... I mean, the thing about audiences is, as a group, I think they're not a kind group of people. If you start to falter or look like you're struggling, they don't buoy you up with their love. They want to kill you. So, you know, once you're struggling, you're really in trouble because then the room drops away, the atmosphere changes, and you can see them all sitting there, you know, saying, "Go on, what are you going to do about it then? Come on, dance, monkey, dance." It's
Reading the accounts of the time, it seems to me that the women who succeeded became known as serio-comics. In other words, their songs, their patter, was drawn from life experience.
Well, I think that's the difference between men and women in some ways, not just in comedy, but generally, because I think women use their own personal experience much more. They're much more kind of cooperative with each other. They talk about their troubles, whereas men kind of feel that they can't tell everyone. So men will sort of tend to talk about more objective, external things in their lives, whereas women will use their own personal experience. Either they've been let down by a bloke or their marriage has gone wrong. I just think that's a natural way for women to communicate. So the kind of push must have been so much harder to make for them. And I just think They must have been absolutely wonderful, and I just really wish I could have met some of them. They sound absolutely great.
In 1861, the year that Morton built the Oxford, the magnificent Alhambra opened its doors.
Give my regards to Leicester Square.
It stood on the site now occupied by the Odeon Cinema in Leicester Square. Serio-comic singers were not the only female attractions here. In keeping with its enthusiasm for opera and picture galleries, the music hall was about to come to the rescue of another great cultural institution. I met John Earl again on the site where the Alhambra had stood.
One of the most exciting things about this period, to me at least, is the fact that the music halls became the home of the ballet. Any music hall that was large enough to have a stage would mount ballets of some sort, and at the Alhambra they were particularly spectacular. The ballet had been pretty well ditched by the Royal Opera House.
Really?
And Her Majesty's. This is not the elite ballet for the upper classes. It was called at the time Ballet for the Million, and I think that's a very good description. And Ballet for the Million meant lovely legs. Most of the ballets that were performed at this sort of music hall are now forgotten because they were ephemeral, but that doesn't mean they were rubbish.
I put a cutting in here. This is an illustration.
That is gorgeous. It's a huge set, for one thing, and a very expert set, too. We had some of the best scene painters in the world in London. But
We still do.
And we still do,
We still
yes.
do, yeah.
It's the sheer size of that set.
Huge production.
And the number of people on the stage. The music hall had kept the ballet alive, and when the Russian ballet arrived, they were astonished to find there was already a ballet audience in London.
The music halls seemed able to absorb and adapt any form of entertainment and produce their own unique version for mass consumption. In the 1870s, they even became something of a political debating chamber.
The popularity of the music halls at all levels of Victorian society meant that they offered a real barometer of national opinion on the important matters of the day. The tone of the halls was conservative, with a small C and a large C. They were working-class Tories, like me.
The leader of the Conservative Party, Benjamin Disraeli, was enjoying a period of popular support from the working classes for legislation which restricted the amount of time they could spend at work. Gladstone's Liberal Party, on the other hand, were distrusted for trying to restrict the amount of time they could spend in the pub. The British drinking man hated to be lectured on his refreshments. Gladstone was seen as a killjoy, and Disraeli became their hero.
Music hall audiences were also fiercely patriotic, and Disraeli scored again in 1877 when he took a very strong line on Russian imperialism in the Balkans.
The Russian declaration of war against the Ottoman Empire became known as the Eastern Crisis and polarized public opinion for and against British intervention. In the library of the Garrick Club, there is a complete set of the theatrical newspaper, The Era, which widely reported these events. To the great surprise of the establishment, this debate got an airing on the stage of the music halls. Historian Michael Diamond has dug out a few cuttings.
In the 1870s, the first great period of political agitation on the music halls broke out. Britain must be strong. Disraeli was pro-Turkish. Gladstone was against the Turks and for the Russians. And this really whipped up the music halls into a frenzy. So you've got, above all, one of the most famous music hall songs of all, "We Don't Want to Fight, but by Jingo if we do. We've got the ships, we've got the men, we've got the money too."
We don't want to fight, but by jingo if we do. We've got the men, we've got the ships, and got the money too. We've fought the bear before, and while we're Britain's true, the Russians shall not have Constantinople. The end of that song is a little weak, isn't it? It doesn't rhyme, of course, but trying to find a rhyme for Constantinople is probably a lost cause.
This unleashed a whole succession of songs of this kind about the Russian bear, the turkey. The Russian bear wanted to eat the turkey. The British lion stopped the Russian bear from eating the turkey. Then you've got the French cock and the Austrian and German eagles thrown in. And there's a sort of zoological subsection of music hall song, which was incredibly popular.
But politically driven.
And politically driven. And it's worth remembering that, of course, a lot of the people who went to the music halls didn't have the vote. And at the next election after this furore, Disraeli and Conservatives lost. The music halls would have liked to have thought that the politicians were hanging on their every word. Actually, the class system in the country didn't mean that they took much notice.
By the 1880s, music halls were part of the very fabric of Victorian life. And if you lived in urban Britain at this time, you wouldn't have had to walk very far to visit one. A parliamentary report in 1888 noted that London had 50 theatres, 35 concert halls and 473 music halls. But there was a risk associated with an evening out at the halls: fire. Moreton suffered more than most. The Oxford went up in flames in February 1868, and its replacement met the same fate only 4 years later. The Alhambra, which he also managed, burnt down in December 1882. The final straw was the fire at the Theatre Royal in Exeter, in which 190 people died. Legislation followed, and over 200 halls were closed down as they failed to obtain the necessary certificate of suitability. Those that survived underwent profound changes. The City Varieties in Leeds is undergoing a major restoration at present, but it's a good place to see how the new building regulations altered the experience of visiting a music hall. Dave Wilmore is a theatre historian working on the project.
Oh, wow. Ah, breathtaking.
If you look at the built record of music halls and theatres in the 19th century, I think the average life of the theatre, the expectancy of it, is about 15 years. That's either because you want to rebuild it and make it bigger because it's such a commercial success, or more likely it burns down, which just tells you how fantastic it is that this is a survivor. Originally it was this flat-floored music hall with tables, loose chairs.
Lots of booze.
Lots of booze, lots of activity.
Bar at the back.
Yeah, probably not even licensed to a capacity, you know. If people turned up, they'd sell a ticket and let them in.
No health and safety?
No, not really.
None at all.
Not at all. Loose seating was clearly dangerous. In the event of panic, people run and the loose seats get knocked over.
So you go from a free-for-all to rows of formal seats as we understand the theatre today.
Indeed. And I suppose if you're wearing a commercial hat, you can probably get more people in than having a more laissez-faire seating arrangement around little circular tables.
Between 1953 and 1983, this theatre was the home of The Good Old Days, a series which recreated the atmosphere of the music halls. It was chaired in a very personal style by Leonard Sachs.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, born in Leeds, now illustrious London luminary, Mr. Barry Cryer! My girl's a Yorkshire girl, Yorkshire through and through.
This notion of the chairman, the Leonard Sachs character in the good old days, was that for real?
Oh, absolutely. There was a chairman, and in the early days he was probably the licensee. And then at some point later, the licensee becomes less important. And at that point, I think, the chairman starts to become less of a character. And then you start to find that with the fixing down of the seating, the whole feeling of the performance changes. And we have the changing in lighting conditions in the auditorium. Here, you would have had the transition from gas in the early days to the electricity. And you can control electricity much easier than you can gas. But it does allow you to introduce the concept of blackouts in performance.
Almost overnight, the whole atmosphere of the halls changed. The brightly lit room with its loose tables and chairs was replaced by fixed seating in a darkened auditorium. The theatre and the music hall, who had gone their separate ways after the Theatres Act in 1843, found their paths converging some 40 years later. But none of these changes had any effect on the popularity of the entertainment on offer. The music halls held up a mirror to their audience, reflecting a comical, sentimental vision of their own working lives. The Cockney coster became a regular turn in the 1880s. A costermonger was an itinerant fruit and veg seller, a romantic working-class stereotype that could be admired by all. The most successful costers had questionable qualifications as cockneys. One of the first was the Great Vance, whose costermonger Joe disguised his former profession as a solicitor's clerk. Or Albert Chevalier, who was dubbed the Coster's Laureate, even though he was born on the Royal Crescent in Notting Hill. A more authentic model was Gus Elan, formerly an egg packer, who had a massive hit with If It Wasn't for the Houses in Between.
It was supposed to be a parody on, in the 90s, the middle classes, mania for gardens, trying to ape the upper classes, I suppose, with their estates. And this is the song about a Cockney. He was, presumably had a barrow. He didn't have a garden, he had a backyard. If you saw my little backyard, what a pretty spot you'd cry. Oh, it's a picture on a sunny summer day, with the turnip tops and cabbages, what people doesn't buy. On a Sunday market, I make 'em look all gay. Oh, the neighbours thinks I grows 'em, and you'd fancy you're in Kent, or in Hepsom, if you'd gazed into the mews. It's a wonder as a landlord doesn't want to pay the rent, because we've got such nobby distant view. Oh, it really is a very pretty garden, and Chingford to the eastward could be seen. With a ladder and some glasses, you can see to Hackney Marshes. If it wasn't for the houses in between.
Very good.
Isn't it? Gus Elan,
Good
yes.
lyric, isn't it? Very good.
The coster was just one amongst a gallery of familiar stock characters that appeared on every bill. Irish and Scottish acts were particularly popular.
We are going to go roaming in the gloaming by the bonny banks of Clyde.
Harry Lauder became the most famous Scotsman in the world, singing his own compositions like Roman in the Gloamin'.
I've seen lots of bonny lasses travelling far and wide, but my heart is centred now on bonny Kate McBride.
Lauder, a former miner, was often criticised in Scotland as a crude caricature of a Scot, and the stereotypical tight-fisted Scotsman may owe a great deal to Lauder's stage act.
Roaming in the gloaming on the bonny banks of Clyde.
In his early days, he was just as likely to perform as an Irishman. English audiences unfamiliar with the nuances of the accent seemed just as happy either way.
Oh, it's lovely roaming in the gloaming.
You have to start with the stereotype, with the character that everybody will recognise. You've only got a very short time, a term, well, 7 minutes. You can't build up some character from nowhere. You can't come on and have people think, oh, what might this be meant to represent? That's not going to work. So you come on dressed as a stage Irishman with a shillelagh and a crushed hat and collapsing corduroy trousers, and they know who you are.
The biggest stars of the music hall were by now becoming household names, better known than the Prime Minister, and usually more popular. David Drummond, who runs a small shop just off the Charing Cross Road, has a treasure trove of material related to these performers. This shop really is an Aladdin's cave of music hall ephemera. Mention almost any performer from the heyday of the halls, and David will have something tucked away to show you.
What do we know about Little Tish?
Oh, his real name was Harry Relf.
He was more of a physical comedian.
Yes, but he was... first of all, he was small. He was most famous for these big boots. And I have somewhere his date book, and there is not one free date the entire year.
Oh, that looks like a contract. I recognise a contract anywhere.
This is a contract for our little Titch to appear in
Star comedian, it
Yep.
says.
Look at the salary.
£225 per week.
What would that be now?
20,000. Little Titch's contemporary Dan Leno, a full 9 inches taller, started his career as a clog dancer, but eventually became the most popular comedian on the halls.
And Mother's at the bottom of it all.
There's a world of truth in that. Oh, there's bits of patter, tiny bits of patter in between the verses here. Oh, they do beat me, and of course you daren't hit a woman. Well, I know I daren't. They've got a big laugh, I bet. Terrible material, isn't it? I don't know what I wanted to get married for.
With respect, I think it's the way you perform it.
Maybe. My life's one long wretchedness. And it's all through a woman with a coal black eye. Wonderful. Another hugely popular music hall staple were the male impersonators, female comic singers who dressed as men. A woman wearing trousers was considered quite shocking at the time, but once again, the music halls seemed to get away with it.
Ah, well, there we are. They've got Vesta Tilly here.
Wow, look at that. And there she is, as a fine gentleman. Well, you wouldn't want to cross her, would you?
What you might be interested in, that is Vesta Tilly's waistcoat. And it's very frail.
Fine silk. She probably flattened her boobs, didn't she, for the effect? She certainly wasn't petite, if that fitted her.
No, no.
Vesta Tilly was real music hall nobility, the best remembered male impersonator on the halls, eventually becoming Lady de Vries when her husband was knighted. But she was already something of a toff in her on-stage persona.
If you contrast Vesta Tilly with the male on the music halls, he is the idol of the young men, in fact, in the audience, the clerks who have just got enough money together to come to the West End Music Hall. He struts on with an explosive champagne bottle and songs about being drunk and songs about the number of women that he's mashed and lots of aggressive masculinity and huge mutton chuck whiskers and stomping about, being, okay, quite sexy, but quite scary. Whereas Vesta Tilly's young men, you would want to pet. They're little boys, doing their best to be like that, but not really like that. And they're so much more romantic, and they're so much less threatening.
Musical audiences loved seeing threat reduced to comic caricature. But looking back at their portrayal of black people is quite shocking for us today. When black American minstrel troupes arrived in London in the 1840s, they became hugely popular. The music halls appropriated the musical style, but the songs were performed by white men in blackface makeup.
One of the most obviously appalling things to us is the way that it was absolutely central to an enormous amount of Victorian entertainment that white men blacked their faces and pretended to be black men. We have all kinds of problems about that, obviously, but one of our problems is that we cannot imagine what, to a Victorian audience, it would mean to see somebody with a black face. There were not that many people with black faces around. In America, it was very different, of course. In America, the impersonating of black people by white people was all connected with slavery. In the music halls, the absolutely ubiquitous blackface act moves away from being the kind of thing that the Americans originally brought to being a kind of broad clowning. So it's a mask, and then it taps into very deep roots in British culture of folk masking, of people blacking their faces to burn the ricks, to dance, to carry out strange antique rituals. All of those things sit behind it for the British audience, I think.
People knew so little of what the lives were like of African Americans on the southern plantations, that it could not be seen as really attacking them personally. What I think happens with blackface minstrelsy is that there's a mixture of fear in the reception of the music, that people don't understand what black people are like. They're very attracted to the music. And then you find that an instrument that previously would be seen as a mark of degradation, like the banjo, goes more and more upmarket until by the time we're in the latest century, even the Prince of Wales wants to learn to play the banjo, and he hires a black banjo player, James Bohee, to teach him to play the banjo.
By the 1890s, British imperialism and confidence in its positive benefits for the world was at its height. The word empire was everywhere, and Edward Moss, a theatrical impresario from Scotland, chose it for his new chain of large musical theatres. At the same time, another chain was established by Oswald Stoll from his base in Liverpool. These two organisations either built new theatres or took over existing venues until they had a considerable grip on music hall entertainment in the provinces. They became known as the syndicates, and they introduced another seismic change in the way the music hall operated. Back in the Garrick Library, the era gives us a good idea of how the system worked.
To fill their chains of theatres with new acts, Stoll and Moss built up their own roster of performers who went from town to town each week. And instead of one long show across the whole evening, they discovered they could double their money by dividing it into two houses. Now, of course, that would have to work like clockwork, and the secret to that lies in these pages here.
The syndicates would publish a list of the acts appearing at the Empires the following week, along with travel information, rehearsal times and stage calls for the two nightly performances. It was an intricately detailed operation on a massive scale, ensuring a completely new roster of acts would appear in each theatre every week.
Any last vestiges the music hall had of its folksy origins, jolly amateur evenings in the back room of the pub, had gone forever. This was now big business, and the big boys had taken over.
Using their conglomerate muscle, Stoll and Moss wanted to ensure their middle-class audience would find nothing vulgar to offend them at their Empires. But the double entendre had developed for a reason, and it proved almost impossible to stamp out.
Tell us about Daddy Wouldn't Buy Me a Bow Wow, which is a perfectly innocent lyric, isn't it?
No, it's not. It's not really. Not to the Victorians. It was innuendo. She's talking about her cat and how it comes to school with her each day and sits upon the form because her cat is her lady's bits. And she wants a bow wow, which is a reference to the man's bit.
I love my little cat, I do. Its fur is oh so warm. It comes with me to school each day and sits upon the form. When teacher asks, why do you bring that little pet of yours? I tell her that I bring my cat along with me because Daddy wouldn't buy me a bow wow. Daddy wouldn't buy me a bow wow. I've got a little cat and I'm very fond of that, but I'd rather have a bow wow wow.
Sometimes, however, the double meaning was very clumsily disguised.
I have brought along a song which, in my experience, is just about the dirtiest I've ever come across. We talk about double entendre. It's called The Tuner's Opportunity, because every middle-class, lower middle-class family had a piano, so you had your piano tuner. So you had
the tuner's opportunity.
To get it, yes. Miss Crotchety Quaver was sweet 17 and a player of infinite skill. She could play all the day, all the evening as well, making all the neighbourhood ill. And to keep her piano in tune, she would have a good tuner constantly there. And he'd pull up her instrument 3 times a week just to keep it in proper repair. And first he tuned it gently, then he tuned it strong, then he'd touch a short note, then he'd pass along, then he'd go with vengeance enough to break the key. At length he tuned whenever he got an opportunity. And that's just the first one.
And it goes on from there.
Yes.
It seemed that the more Victorian society tried to put a lid on sexuality, the more demand built up. Exotic dancing girls became a regular feature of music hall entertainment. The Alhambra became as famous for its can-can girls as it had been for its ballet, and had briefly lost its license when a dancer called Wiry Sal raised her foot higher than her head several times toward the audience and was much applauded. The can-can became a truly global phenomenon, and in 1891, a young English girl called Lottie Collins saw a version of it being performed in New York to a very catchy new song called Tarara Boomdier. She brought it home with her to London and became an overnight sensation.
A sweet tuxedo girl, you see, queen of swell society, just the type you'd like to hold.
Lottie would begin the first verse very demurely, then explode into the chorus with her legs kicking and skirts swirling to expose an indecent amount of stocking, suspender, bare thigh and more. The nutty 90s were in full swing. The very epitome of naughtiness, however, was not a chance glimpse of Lottie's stocking tops, but the legendary wink of another EastEnder, Marie Lloyd. Marie's career began on the stage of the Eagle when she was 14, and it was obvious from the outset that she possessed a great deal of charm and charisma. Innuendo was not hard to detect in songs like She'd Never Had Her Ticket Punched Before, which told the story of a country girl arriving at Euston for the first time. On a similar theme, in Oh Mr. Porter, a young woman accidentally catches the wrong train, but the message is that she has gone too far.
Oh, Mr. Porter, what shall I do? I want to go to Birmingham and they're taking me on to cruise. Send me back to London as quickly as you can. Oh, Mr. Porter, what a silly girl I am.
The rapid spread of the railways across Victorian Britain offered a rich new vein of sexual metaphor, which was enthusiastically embraced by the music hall songwriters. The moral crusaders knew it was rude, but how do you outlaw a song about shunting?
These music hall performers, they got these stories told about them. Sometimes they were very rude. One is that Marie Lloyd sang a song called She Sits Amongst the Cabbages and Peas, and she was told she couldn't sing this, so she altered it to She Sits Amongst the Cabbages and Leeks. And if ever people talk about Marie Lloyd now, they quote this song, but there never was such a song, and certainly Marie never sung it. Now, my grandma, who was very much of a typical Victorian person, who was very straight-laced, and she loved Marie Lloyd, and she said the thing about Marie Lloyd was her personality. She was so warm, and she was able to project to the audience, and she had a lot of vulgar innuendo, but nothing really offensive. And that was one of the things that Marie was so successful. Other people probably had better songs, but they didn't have the personality that Marie had.
Marie Lloyd became and probably remains the greatest star the music hall ever produced. But there'd always been a section of Victorian society who felt she represented the worst sort of vulgarity, and that music halls corrupted the minds of their audience. In the 1890s, these moral guardians began to make their presence felt.
The National Vigilance Association was formed to encourage the suppression of criminal vice and public immorality. And they saw plenty of that in the music halls, both on the stage and off.
It wasn't just the ballerina's legs or the can-can girl's garters. There was a new vogue for living statues or pose plastique. This involved a group of figures who would pose stock still on stage in the attitude of classical statuary or famous paintings. They almost invariably included a virtually naked female Venus, if not several. These disreputable performances were seen to encourage the public immorality they sought to stamp out. A prominent voice in the vigilance movement was a Mrs. Laura Ormiston Chant, who devoted herself to the cause.
Mrs. Ormiston Chant spent the warm summer evenings of 1894 patrolling the 5-shilling tier promenade of the Empire Leicester Square here, making copious notes of the contact between the sexes.
The promenade bars were the last vestiges of the old informal nature of the original music halls, but they had become notorious places where prostitutes plied their trade. Mrs. Ormiston Chant discounted from her survey accompanied ladies, those without makeup, and those who avoided the gaze of gentlemen with whom they were unacquainted. Once this minority were excluded, it was plain that there were a great many women who were there for the very worst of reasons.
Her evidence to the licensing authorities briefly closed down the Empire. We have no right to sanction on the stage that which, if it were done in the street, would compel a policeman to lock the offender up. The place at night is the habitual resort for prostitutes in pursuit of their traffic, and that portions of the entertainment are most objectionable, obnoxious, and against the best interest and moral well-being of the community at large. The theatre was closed until a screen was erected between the promenade and the auditorium. A vocal opponent of this was a young Sandhurst cadet by the name of Winston Churchill.
Did you see the papers about the riot at the Empire last Saturday? It was I who led the rioters,
he boasted to his brother. He and his colleagues tore down the wooden canvas screens, and he climbed up onto the debris and addressed the theatre audience on the subject of liberty. He described it as his true maiden speech. Churchill may have gone on to greater things, but it was Mrs. Ormiston Chant who more accurately reflected the mood of the age. Respectability was becoming a Victorian obsession and was the cornerstone of the success of the syndicates. In Leeds, in 1898, the Empire Palace Theatre opened. It was built by the newly formed Moss Empire Syndicate, an amalgamation of the Stoll and Moss organisations. Though they were still very much a provincial operation, it was a clear sign of their confidence and ambition. Determined to place music hall at the heart of mainstream city life, alongside the theatre, they built a hotel and one of the world's first purpose-built shopping malls, a far cry from the city varieties across the street. The theatre itself is now a department store, but Barry Cryer remembers it well.
One of my earliest memories was being taken out to the theatre with my mother. We had the city varieties. No decent woman would be seen there. So we go now and again to the Empire, number 1, Moss Empire. I remember the atmosphere. It was brash and colourful and noisy and people arriving, and then you went into the auditorium. It was just magical. And then the curtain goes up and it gets even better, and the band strike up and all that. And I sat next to my mother in the theatre, watching her twinkling away, loving every minute of it. It was superb.
The architect who designed every part of this bold development, from the Grand Theatre to the last square of mosaic in the pavements, was Frank Matcham. Matcham was undoubtedly a genius who could thread his way through the increasingly complex Victorian building regulations and still produce a stunning, thrilling and magical space. These arcades earned Leeds the title the Milan of the north of England. Moss Empire's progress towards London was like the stealthy approach of an invading army who first established outposts in the suburbs before the final push. One of these was the Hackney Empire, another Matcham masterpiece. He was extraordinarily inventive as an architect, and Hackney is a stylistic mashup of Moorish, Indo-Romanesque Baroque. But a Victorian theatregoer's enjoyment of this opulence was very much affected by their social class. Hoffman Reed has worked at the Empire for 20 years.
Where we are in the gallery was generally poor people, very working class people. There used to be a sign up here, no spitting or swearing. Offenders will be ejected by order. So, I mean, that gives you some sort of idea of the sort of people who they expected in the gallery.
But they had their own entrance.
Absolutely, their entrance is at the rear of the theatre. So it's only them who come in through it.
So who came in the front of the theatre?
The front of the theatre was reserved solely for the dress circle and the front stalls, the photos, the armchairs.
Yeah.
Back of the stalls area was actually a separate entrance called the pit, where you'd have people selling goods and services, no doubt.
Goods and services.
Which were easily accessible to gentlemen in the front rows.
Say no more.
Without, as such, having to leave to go to another floor to be seen clearly amongst another class of people.
How long did it take to build this magnificent
Well, at the turn of the century, 36 weeks from scratch. And that is without the modern technology we'd have now. By today's standards, you couldn't literally paint it in that time.
You couldn't paint it in 36 weeks?
There's very little you get done in 36 weeks now. It was absolutely state-of-the-art when it was built. It's one of the first theatres with cantilevered balconies.
Oh, really?
So there's pre-stressed concrete balconies, no pillars, which is where the incredible sight lines come from, because you have unobstructed views from every floor. A couple of years ago, we had Madness doing a reunion kicking out. You had about 300 guys reliving their youth in their mid-30s, jumping up and down, and you could see it literally flex.
Well, this is down in the dress circle.
This is the dress circle, literally, and it must have been flexing by about 4 inches up and down, the whole of it.
If you really want to understand why Frank Matcham was the greatest theatre architect that ever lived, you only have to sit here where I'm sitting, the worst seat in the house. I have got a fabulous view of everything. And yet, in all Matcham's theatres, as far as I can tell, there were never problems with the sound.
No, well, I think there's a lot more science actually applied to it than he's given credit for. The stage itself acts as a speaker. The shape of the auditorium acts as a cone, if you like.
How did he know that stuff, Matcham? I'd rather like to test that. Would you mind going on the stage and asking me a question very quietly, and I'll see if I can hear it from back here?
Absolutely, it'd be a pleasure.
Okay, thank you. I'll leave you. There we go. Don't do any of my material now. While you're down there. Can you hear me? I can hear you. Hoffman, the two domes on either side of the proscenium, what are they made of?
It's all plasterwork. All of it is Rococo plasterwork.
What's amazing is there's no echo, there's no reverb, there's incredible crystal clarity. I can hear every syllable. Amazing.
The Hackney Empire was the technological wonder of the age, one of the first theatres to be built with a projection box to show the new Bioscope movies. The Bioscope had begun as a fairground attraction, but was now a feature of every music hall bill, an ominous development that would have far-reaching consequences. In 1912, at the Palace Theatre, Oswald Stoll received his ultimate accolade when he was invited to arrange the Royal Music Hall performance by command of His Majesty. Stoll wanted to make it a night to remember and decorated the theatre with 3 million roses, most of them clustered around the Royal Box, which looked like a florist shop. The event was staged in front of George V and a smattering of other related minor European royalty.
On a hot July night, the King himself, for the very first time, came to see the stars of the music hall on their home turf.
His father, Edward VII, loved dressing up for a party and often invited music hall stars to perform at his private soiree. But by coming to the theatre himself, his son was publicly acknowledging that music hall was finally and undeniably respectable.
142 artists were specially chosen to appear on this stage. It was a balanced bill representing all facets of the music hall. There was one pointed omission, Marie Lloyd.
This newly won respectability was too precious to be put at risk by the legendary Wink. She staged a rival performance the same evening at the London Pavilion. "By order of the British public," said the poster. But she needn't have worried. Back up the road at the Palace, things weren't going at all according to plan. The theatre was packed with specially invited bigwigs, and there was none of the usual rapport with the performers on which the music hall stars relied. A young comedienne called Fanny Fields nervously told the audience that "I'm suffering just as much as you are." In a strange twist, this high watermark of music hall fortunes also seemed to emphasise how little this performance had in common with the original spirit of its birth.
Having achieved the common admiration of the king and the costermonger, the music hall may have gained in status, but it had lost any connection with its roots.
In 1914, when the First World War broke out, the minor royals who attended the command performance found themselves on opposite sides of the barbed wire. The troops dug trenches while singing the music hall's greatest hits. But back in Blighty, the war closed many of the halls for the duration. The male impersonators were hugely popular, turning out in military uniform. Vesta Tilley earned the nickname Britain's best recruiting sergeant and distributed chocolate to the Tommies. But songs like "Good Luck to the Girl Who Loves a Soldier" expressed a very different sentiment to the jingo songs of 40 years earlier. And when the war was over, the halls, like everything else, had changed. In 1919, the King visited Frank Matcham's magnificent London Coliseum, the grandest theatre in Moss Empire's chain, but it was to attend the Royal Variety performance. Variety, the sanitised child of the music hall, had quietly replaced its unruly parent. There were other competitors for the punters' pennies. Stars could now be heard on the gramophone. Radio was just around the corner, and most significantly, cinema had hit the big time.
We're at the back of the balcony at the Britannia Glasgow, and this is a projection booth which was just hacked into the back of the building so they could project the great novelty of the bioscope moving pictures onto the stage.
What began as a minor attraction at the bottom of the bill had become the headlining act. And at some point in these interwar years, people began to refer to the music hall in the past tense.
Late Night BBC4 exploring our tradition of satire and bawdy humour, from political cartoons to Spitting Image to radio's Round the Horn and TV's Till Death Us Do Part. Rude Britannia is next.